All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Eileen Block, part of the ASAN Institute for Foreign Policy Studies, and I'll serve as the moderator and discussant for our second panel today. We will now explore two overarching themes of this conference on identity and power, and we already heard a little bit earlier this morning, and I hope we could dive a little deeper into these topics. So we're going to look specifically on how nationalism, national identity, and power in South Korea intersect and how they're interpreted at home and abroad. We'll also look at how power in identity and its societal and economical value, while also looking how that power inhibits or encourages change in identity itself. So we have a very good star lineup of experts here today to help us go into these topics from different perspectives. And before our panelists join me on stage for discussion, I'll invite each one to the podium to give their brief presentation for about 10 to 12 minutes. And following that, we'll have our own discussion and open that up to the panel at around 11:30. So first and foremost, I would like to invite Dr. Jiun Bang to the podium. And while you come up, I'll do a brief introduction of what you're going to be showing us today. So Dr. Jiun Bang, she's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan, and she received her PhD from the USC. Her research interests include international relations theory, security, and Northeast Asia. Drawing from her doctoral project research, Jiun will examine the business of nationalism in Northeast Asia and how that is packaged, repackaged, and sold as commercial interests. More specifically, she will approach the issue of territorial disputes in the region by using this framework. So without further ado, I want to give the floor to Jiun. Thank you.
Great, thank you for coming. I'm going to go straight into my presentation. Today I'll be talking about nationalism, but in keeping with this theme of being brave, I'm going to give you a very different interpretation of nationalism, and I'm going to talk about where political activity meets the marketplace. And hence, the numbers below this barcode are actually GPS coordinates of the contentious territory of Dokdo Takeshima between Japan and South Korea. And I think it encapsulates this idea of me talking about commercial activity with politics. So how did I get into this in the first place? I was reading this very dominant popular discourse in nationalism about elite manipulation. And basically it talks about how elites are able to tap into nationalist sentiments to sway the masses to their favor. And I thought there were a few weaknesses. And so for one, what I call immaculate conception. So we are to believe that as soon as the words leave the mouth of the elites, they somehow travel and impregnate the hearts and minds of the masses without really even knowing what the specific conduits for the transmission really is. And so second, it relates to the first point. The public is seen as very passive consumers of this nationalism. And so there's a very clear division of labor between who is doing what. And so third, relatedly, there's not much interaction between the government with the masses in making the nationalist narrative. And so last, there's not much interaction between markets and politics at all. Taking this into consideration, I'm basically arguing that all else being equal, greater commodification of nationalism will result in greater bilateral tensions. And I look specifically at territorial sovereignty because it's a very non-controversial issue that gets to nationalism. What does this all mean, though, really? Instead of treating nationalism as an emotion or affect, even maybe a movement, I'm treating it as if it were a commodity that can be produced, consumed, and reproduced on the market. And so I can reinforce this link between why people really buy into nationalism. I talked about why I care, so I want to give you a bit about why you should care, the contribution, right? So first, I'm treating nationalism as a variable rather than a constant. And to talk a bit about what this means, just as consumption waxes and wanes, so too does nationalism if you think of it as a consumption behavior, right? And so there's a tendency to treat nationalism as only going in one direction, which is up, but rarely do we think about the downside, so when it decreases. And taking it as a commodity this way allows me to think about it as a more dynamic variable that waxes and wanes. Second, I can decouple nationalism from violence. So again, there's a tendency to couple nationalism and also tensions with violence, but I actually look at sub-war level diplomatic political disputes. And third, and most importantly, it explores consumerism with citizenship. And so how does the marketplace afford a new space for one to express one's political identity? Right? And it brings up a very, very interesting question about if I'm a producer of nationalism, is it a very liberating behavior as I become more empowered through profits that I make in the market? Or is it a very oppressive behavior as I become more tied to the state and the state cause? So am I an extension of the state? So I'm going to talk a bit about my independent variable, which is the explanatory variable, or the causal variable, and it is commodification. And so the easiest way to think about this is along this matrix of you have consumables, also called tangibles, or you have non-consumables or intangibles. And so under consumables, you have things like food, beverages, and clothing. So think about a T-shirt with a big, loud message on territorial sovereignty. And for non-consumables, there are experiences. So tourism, museums, even nationwide competitions that give prizes for the best impressive essay on territorial sovereignty protection. Right? So the attribute of these foods and drinks, they're portable, they're also very multifunctional, and they in some way streamline the message in a very clear manner. And the attribute of these non-consumables is that they are very participatory, and so the consumers can really get into this process of developing the nationalist rhetoric. And to give you a few examples of these consumables in particular, so things like a restaurant that serves diayu, also known as Senkaku Islands, noodles and soups, or you have Takeshima manju on the left, you also have Tokto bread on the right corner, and you have some Northern Territory snacks on the left in the middle there. Just some few examples to get the message across. And so let me talk about the dependent variable, or the outcome that I seek to explain, which is tensions or bilateral tensions. And so it's a very important point here that I go over this because the tendency for us to think about tensions is only two ways. Those are type 1, dormant tensions, and type 4, maximal. And by this I mean when we think about low tensions or high tensions, the volume and intensity always go in lockstep. And so when we think about high tensions, we think about war. Oh, East Asia, it's close to war because we have high tensions. And that's because we are linking volume with intensity. And actually, I create a typology where I disaggregate the two axes. So you could have more types of tensions that not necessarily go to war. So these blue types, quadrants, are new tensions that you can see if you disaggregate volume from intensity. So things like type 2, homeostatic. So you could keep having low-level tensions, but a lot of them without drifting into war. And my logic is by talking about commodification, we can really think about how it differs from militarization because it doesn't impact necessarily the intensity, just the volume. And so you might ask, how am I measuring tensions? It's a very difficult task. And I decided to construct a database of bilateral summonses in Northeast Asia. And a summons is where the foreign ministry of one country calls in the ambassador of another country to express displeasure or discontent over a certain issue or dispute. And so I looked at all the summonses that occurred between or among the countries of Japan, South Korea, and China between 1998 to 2015, which gave me a database of 184 points. And as you can see, it does wax and wane, which is very different to what the media will tell you about. It's just been up all the way. And I wanted to do a more in-depth case study. So I looked at, I overlaid the empirical existing territorial disputes in the region with my typology of tensions. And so I have Temado Tsushima Island between Japan and South Korea in type 1, and Dokdo Takeshima, the homeostatic version, in type 2. So my theory suggests that volume should be affected by commodification, so I decided to look at those two disputes. And just to, the advantage of doing this was, not only are they the same two countries, but different disputes with varying levels of tensions. To give you a very brief evidence for the case study that I did, so the first one is Temado Tsushima. And as what your gut is telling you, it's a very low case of tensions, and there's also a very low case of commodification there. But at one point, South Korean tourists overtook the entire population of Tsushima City in 2001. So there was a lot of tourism. And if you do careful process tracing, you see that there was a very action-reaction from when we see increased tourism and Japanese government becoming very worried and concerned about investments and injections of money by South Koreans, which is a very different case to Dokdo Takeshima, where we see a lot of commodification and quite a bit of tensions. And what is very interesting is this 2005 Dokdo Sustainable Use Act that the South Korean government passes. And this just creates a very whole of government, let's infuse money into the island sort of approach. And not only that, there's a very big increase in tourism. As part of this DSUP, the government scraps the cap on how many people can visit the island daily by 2009, which in effect has a 9,000% increase in tourists to the island, and of which only less than 1% are foreigners. So it's mostly South Koreans going as tourism. And this is another very interesting chart. So I thought, quantification, everyone's so interested in quantification these days. How can I quantify something? And so I had a very hard time trying to think about how I can quantify this level of commercial activity or commodification. And I decided to look at trademark applications. So how many businesses, including subnational governments, are applying for trademarks? And so in their name of the business would have something like Dokdo bread or Takeshima manju. Right? So I looked at all the instances of trademarks from 98 to 2015. And so you also do see waxing and waning, and I overlaid this with tensions. And that was sort of my way of getting at not only gauging this level of commodification, but also quantification and how that relates to tensions. Just a bit on policy implications. What to take away? First, there's an approach to think about tensions as just being there without having much human agency. But if you think about tensions and nationalism in a consumption manner, you can see how there is a lot of human agency behind tensions. And the fact that nationalism requires a lot of momentum and effort. And it's a very different approach to thinking about tensions that way. And also specifically going back to my typology of tensions, you prevent yourself from misdiagnosing war prospects because maybe volume and intensity don't go hand in hand. Maybe commodification has different impact. Just to summarize, so I told you about tensions, how nationalism and commodification of nationalism affects tensions. And I want to give you this great quote from an interview that I did with the CEO of Dokdo Bread in 2015. He said, "To be honest, there is still a negative societal perception that patriots and profits don't mix. But in the end, it's money that enables the patriots to protect their country. You can't avoid the issue of money." And this gets to this my idea about how the marketplace and political activity interact. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, June. Next, I would like to invite Steve and Denny to take the podium. You already know a little bit about Stephen Denny from the beginning panel, and he's already gave us a bit of a teaser into his presentation of identity in South Korea. And just again, Stephen, he's a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto and a doctoral fellow at the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs. I don't need to do another plug of sinonk.com. Just kidding. But today, Stephen, he's going to go a little more in depth and share his findings and observations from his long-term project on measuring and understanding ethnic nationalism of Koreans, especially of resettled North Korean migrants in South Korea, and sharing those findings and implications for nationalism and national identity. So, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning and greetings. To you, what does it mean to be truly South Korean? Since the early 1990s, a slow but certain demographic transition has been underway in the Republic of Korea. An influx of migrants, international brides, and non-ethnic Koreans has been chipping away at the notion that South Korea is an ethnically homogenous nation. This process of change has precipitated a new discourse on South Korean nationhood and what it means to be South Korean. And it has led some to conclude that ethnic nationalism is on the decline, that ethnicity or race is no longer the defining component of Korean national identity. So today I'm going to challenge that conclusion by providing a snippet of an ongoing project into the study of South Korean national identity by looking at resettled North Korean migrants. Here's some basic questions to help orient your mind, and I'm going to provide some answers over the course of my discussion today, and I will read them with you. What can North Korean migrants tell us about identity change or non-change in contemporary South Korea? And what are the lessons for Korea and beyond? As I mentioned, there are a number of contemporary scholars who have concluded, based upon various research, that ethnic nationalism in South Korea is on the decline or has been eroded or has gone away. Here you can see a brief snippet of some of the articles that have been published, including one from Catherine Moon. A lot of the research has been based upon public opinion data. When I was at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies in Seoul, this data came out in 2003. And these are answers to the question, to be truly Korean, is it important to have the Korean bloodline? And as you can see, there is a difference between younger people and older people. Younger people think it's less important. Older people think it's more important. This has led some to conclude that because of generational effects, or the differences in the conditions under which people come of age, that Korean ethnicity is no longer a defining feature or predominant feature of South Korean national identity. I want to challenge this conclusion, and I think it's due to a silo problem. It's interesting, silo has come up many times already, and I did not know that this word was going to be used so much. But let's talk about the silo. And what I mean by silo here is the idea that for South Koreans, you were born in Korea, you go to school in Korea, you graduate from Korea, you get married in Korea, and you have a job there. People leave for the obligatory yuak, but do they really settle down? Do they really take on a new identity? Not really. Most people know themselves and others from their own national context. Age, in other words, which is often used as an explanatory variable to predict or to explain an outcome, such as what people think about national identity, is perfectly correlated with exposure. So how do we know what the impact that growing up in South Korea today has on what people think about national identity? Can we talk to young South Koreans of college age and ask them, do you think ethnicity is important to be truly in South Korea? They'll give you an answer. But what will they think in 15 years from now? And how do we know what the impact of growing up in South Korea today has on this answer? The data that I showed you a moment ago here, it's a snippet in time. It's in 2013. Unfortunately, we don't have data going back to 1975 to compare how the answers have varied or not over time. So what South Korean people think today at the age 25 may be what South Korea people in 1975 at the age 25 also thought. It's hard to say what exactly they might have answered because we don't have the data. Hence, we're contributing to this silo problem. So how do we get around this? Well, there are ways, and I'm going to present one. Since the early 2000s, picking up in the mid-2000s, a number of North Korean defectors, migrants, refugees, I'll allow you to choose your preferred word, have begun resettling in South Korea. Today, there are about 29,000 of them, ethnic Koreans who were born elsewhere, grew up elsewhere, North Korea, who have resettled in South Korea. They can help us overcome the silo problem. They are ethnically Korean, yet they did not grow up in South Korea. In other words, for this group of people, age is not perfectly correlated with exposure. You can measure the impact that being in South Korea has on an ethnic Korean group. So this is where I begin. I've just returned about 2 weeks ago from South Korea, where I was for about 6 months, doing a collaborative project with a number of colleagues who happen to be a part of Sino-NK, of resettled North Korean migrants in South Korea. I've surveyed 350 people using a battery of questions, of which I will report on some of the answers from one category, the national identity category. I also did about 120 interviews. This part's still ongoing from the original 350, but I'm only going to talk a bit about the survey responses. We can talk about what I learned from my interviews informally if you wish, or in the Q&A session. I'm going to report on 250 because the last 100 actually just came in about a week ago, and I have to input it. And for those of you who do data input, you know how long that takes. So I'm giving you a snippet, or a part of the 350. So 250. And here are some basic descriptives. I will give you a few seconds to read through them. I will note that and it stays consistent even after adding the additional 100. About 70%, roughly 70% of my sample is female, which is consistent with the number of females who are defectors in South Korea, which is 70%. So how do you measure the salience of ethnicity, the importance of ethnicity, or ethnic nationalism? Well, I showed you one variable. It's a question that asks very specifically, is the bloodline important to being Korean? Well, there are other variables that are also considered important to the measure of this concept. And they are being born in Korea or any national country, having the bloodline as mentioned, and living one's most life there. So what I've done is I've taken the scores, the responses for these three questions, I've coded and combined and created a new variable called the ethnic score. And it measures the salience of ethnicity to national identity based upon the responses given in my survey. Here are comparative ethnic scores from my sample, the North Korean migrants, and from for South Koreans from the data I showed you previously. It's quite similar. You'll see that the average score for North Korean migrants is slightly higher. This would be expected. Ethnicity is, from what we know empirically and theoretically about how it's treated in North Korea, is a more salient component of the national discourse than it is in South Korea today. Also, the conditions of existence in North Korea are the type of conditions that would produce a stronger sense of ethnic nationalism in the country. Crisis, disconnectedness internationally, and so on. But still, the trajectories for both populations is roughly the same. Even if you just looked at the South Korean data, you would see that there is a linear progression with regards to the salience of ethnicity. But as we said, there's a silo problem, so it's dangerous to conclude based upon data for only South Koreans that it is due to some effect, be it generational, be it a life cycle effect, that is, that age is what explains how someone answers, or some other effect. But inserting the North Korean migrant data, for a group for whom exposure is disaggregated from age, we can start to think about what's going on here. for Koreans living in South Korea today. So what I propose here, and this is only preliminary, but I've got some support for it, which I'm going to elaborate on in a moment. What explains the salience of ethnicity, or how important ethnicity is to being South Korean today, is age. As you age, it will become more important. And this is consistent with findings in political science and sociology, which suggests that as you get older, you tend to be more conservative. Well, what I think I'm seeing in my data is as you get older, you become more ethnically nationalist, is a way to think about it. For those of you who do statistics, you'll recognize this right away. For those of you who do not, I will explain it very simply. It's an ordinary least squared regression using my data. And I want to comment on something what I've done with the age variable, is I've transformed it to take into account not life cycle effects, but social learning. This idea that what you learn in younger years of life have more impact on you. So what happens to you at 12, 14, 16 will have a more lasting, enduring effect on you than what happens to you at 36. So I've transformed the data to take into account of this. And what I've found, simply, is that the only statistically significant predictor of the ethnic score is age. The control variables which I use, which are quite interesting, I don't want to get into here now, but if you would like to talk more about them later, please ask. So here are some of my preliminary conclusions, and I emphasize that they're only preliminary, and I will read them. The older a North Korean migrant is, the more likely it is that she or he will see ethnicity as a salient component of Korean national identity. This conclusion likely holds true for South Koreans as well. Second, like other political attitudes, identity seems partially determined by age. Third, taking into account the effects of social learning, neither time spent in North Korea nor time spent in South Korea significantly affect the salience of ethnicity. In other words, what's doing the explaining here is age. In short, ethnic nationalism may not be on the decline. Implications for further consideration. Given what I've presented you with here today, I want you to think about these two things, sort of bigger questions. First, is ethnic nationalism compatible with democratic or liberal democratic norms? I think not, and that might be problematic for a future South Korea. And a slightly more positive consideration, the second, what will be the role of ethnic nationalism in a post-unification scenario? I want to call upon, just briefly, some of my experiences in doing my 100+ interviews. North Korean migrants are integrating relatively well, especially the older migrants. And the one thing that holds consistent across age groups is that they feel, in part or in whole, a member of South Korean society because of a shared ethnicity. Rogers Brubaker has admonished us to not always think of ethnic nationalism as an entirely bad thing, because it isn't. Times of crisis, as we see on the peninsula regularly reproduced, it can be a mechanism for the production of social solidarity. And I think that might be happening. And I wonder to what extent that happened in post-unification Germany or in wartime Poland. So with these two large questions, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Now I'd like to invite our final presenter, Julie Young, to the podium. So Julie Young, she's the manager of international public relations at the Ladies Professional Golf Association, where her primary interest is the economic and social opportunity that professional golf provides for women and girls. Most fittingly, Julie would take the themes of identity and power from the angle of women's golf diplomacy, which has helped to stir nationalism and is used as a form of soft power in South Korea. And the floor is yours, Julie.
Hi, everyone. If I could just get a show of hands of anyone that actually plays golf in the audience. Who thinks of golf as a diplomatic tool? All right, I have a tough crowd to persuade here, I guess. Be brave and young. Thank you for that. And so, I myself never really thought of golf or sports as being a very heavily diplomatic tool. I was studying at Georgetown on global politics and security, the traditional realms of diplomacy. But, I don't know how many of you are aware that the LPGA is very big in Asia. The athletes are national icons there. And I think that golf showed me that the growing influence of Asia is also seen in the sports realm. And so I'll go through some of the facts and figures during the presentation, but I hope that by the end of today, you see golf as not just being an old man's sport, but something that provides young women with economic opportunities and is something that really brings countries closer together. And just a quick disclaimer that my lawyers insisted that I include. The views today are entirely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the LPGA or any other organization, Georgetown or other, that I may be affiliated with. Now, my thesis is that golf diplomacy has transitioned from a heavily male-dominated stage that was primarily for state officials to currently a form of sports diplomacy that's largely non-governmental actors, such as private citizens and also corporate actors and professional women athletes. And so what do I mean by sports diplomacy? Sports diplomacy is when you enhance international exchange and understanding between countries through sports, and also how countries can use sports and sporting events to generate and further establish their own soft power. And as I was looking through the existing literature on sports diplomacy, I've noticed that there wasn't too much out there, and I hope that this discussion and going further, that more literature about the potential and promise of sports diplomacy is further enhanced. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dr. Victor Cha's book, Beyond the Final Score, and I think that really did push the envelope in terms of generating more dialogue about how sports can serve as a diplomatic tool. If I could just pull very quickly from his book to help sort of provide a basis for sports diplomacy. Dr. Victor Cha wrote that sport matters in world politics because it can create diplomatic breakthroughs or breakdowns in ways unanticipated by regular diplomacy. And just like how the white ping pong ball thawed relations between U.S. and China post-Cold War, I see that the white golf ball is a way that countries in Asia, as well as in Europe and the United States, can be drawn closer together. So the evolution of professional women's golf in Korea. How many of you are familiar with this face? Sari Park. She really was the first Korean player in the LPGA. In 1998, she won the U.S. Women's Open, and this year she's actually retiring. When she first started in 1998, she was one of hundreds of players that was. She was only the only Korean player, and 10 years later, you had 45 Korean players in the LPGA. Today, you have more than 50 players, many of which are in the top 10 highest-earning players in the LPGA. She was also the youngest to win the U.S. Women's Open, which is one of the major championships on the tour. And there was this iconic image of her shooting a golf ball out of a water hazard. She took off her socks and entered the water, showing the sign of really commitment and dedication to the game. And 1998 was a year when Korea was undergoing a very difficult financial crisis. And so Sari Park's win on a global stage really provided the country with sort of a beacon of hope, and it was a source of pride for the country when internationally Korea was being known to not being in the best financial state, but to have this woman athlete bring home this trophy was really a source of pride for the country. Fast forward to 2016, Korea again wins the gold medal in the golf in the Rio Olympics, and this was the first time that golf had re-entered the Olympics after more than 112 years. And so it was no big surprise, I think, to many that MB Park, she brought home the gold, New Zealand brought home the silver, and China brought home the bronze. And again, the golf would be entering the Olympics in 2020 in Tokyo, after which it's going to be determined whether or not golf will continue to be an Olympic sport. But what we've seen through the Olympics is golf being elevated to this international stage. A few weeks ago, the Chinese bronze winner had said that China divides its sports into Olympics and non-Olympics, and as a result of the golf being re-entered into the Olympics, she foresees it being treated somewhat differently within the country, perhaps more investment from the government into the sport and more interest from the general public. Let's see. Just a quick look back at golf diplomacy before the Olympics and before it was on the center stage in Korea. U.S.-Japan had conducted what was a golf ball diplomacy. Here we have Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi and former President Eisenhower playing golf. And there's a great excerpt from a journal, Diplomacy and Statecraft, that was titled Golf Ball Diplomacy Between Former President Richard Nixon and the Prime Ministers of Japan during the late 1960s. And I'll give you some time to just quickly read through it. But former President Nixon had used golf balls as a gesture to help further establish relations with Japan. And the former Prime Minister, Kishi, had said that his kind greeting symbolized the beginning of the end of tense U.S.-Japan relations and golf ball diplomacy. And at the time, Japan was considered the golf capital of the world. And I think many view that now as being Korea, given its prominence on the LPGA and its performance at the Olympics. This is an interesting headline from the early 1980s in Malaysia, whether golf diplomacy is on its way out. And we see here President Obama has used golf extensively for diplomacy. On the upper left, you have President Obama playing golf with the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib. And so, the fact that the question of whether golf diplomacy is on its way out, I think that these images show that it's still pretty heavily conducted in the diplomatic field. Then what are the policy implications of this increase in professional women golfers on the global stage? The economic impact of how Korea is exporting its athletes. Each country has their own golf league, but then the LPGA and there's other regional golf leagues that Korea has been sort of sending off its athletes to. In the LPGA alone, like I had said, there's more than 50 athletes that are waving the Korean flag. And what does that economic impact have? A lot of the tournaments have purses that are over $1 million. And so how that the contributions to the economy that these women athletes are bringing back home is pretty impressive. Private sector participation. The tournaments used to be sponsored heavily by U.S. companies or other Western companies, and now increasingly you see major Japanese companies, Korean companies, Taiwan nonprofit organizations sponsoring these tournaments, and how that provides a platform for many of these companies to raise their brand globally. Female participation in the workforce and tourism. Just in 2016 alone, we have 33 tournaments that are being conducted in over 16 countries, and that in and of itself is an economic driver, when each tournament is coming home to these countries, and it provides an opportunity for fans and athletes to engage. The social impact, and we had spoken earlier about the issue of identity and ethnicity, and I think that sports, and specifically women professional athletes, provide a great opportunity for women to be empowered and to be a part of the economy and to elevate the image of not the submissive Asian woman, but a very strong image of being at the tee box and whipping the driver and sending the ball hundreds of yards down. I think that question of what is identity, what is the Korean woman's identity, can also be further explored. In terms of ethnicity, does sports create a new category of ethnicity? Many of the professional women golfers that we see were born in Korea and yet are waving a different flag now. The #1 golfer in the world, Lydia Ko, was born in Korea, but she is New Zealand and she waves a New Zealand flag and played for New Zealand at the Olympics. Has that category of ethnicity changed in sports is something I think that's further to be considered. Haru Nomura is another athlete that's high profile. She has a Japanese and Korean parent, and how that changes her ethnicity and identity has been an interesting category as well. And lastly, foreign policy. How golf, and I alluded to it earlier in terms of soft power, but how does golf and international sports improve bilateral and international relations, if not create some tension in terms of competition between the two countries? How can serve as a way to increase soft power, provide national prestige and national unity? We spoke briefly about how nationalism can be consumed, and I think that many of the fans in Korea and elsewhere, by going to these tournaments and watching the tournaments online, is a way of consuming nationalism through sports. And lastly, I'm curious to see how China further advances their sports development with the recent win in the bronze in the Olympics. This is a painting from ancient China that shows women back then playing golf, and the origin of golf is still debated. Sometimes the Chinese say that it was originated there. Scotland has a different point of view. But I think that this painting is fascinating to see how early on women were playing sports and something similar to golf. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Julie. I would like to ask for all our panelists to go ahead and take seats, and we can start the discussion. So first, I would just like to use my power as the moderator discussant to provide some of my own thoughts and questions for our panelists before moving on to Q&A with the audience. So just to briefly recap, our panel is about identity and power, and just looking at how identity power is defined as commercial interests, how it's produced, reproduced, North Korean migrants settling in South Korea, and how they look at their national personal identities. And in some ways, not as much different with South Koreans in terms of ethnic nationalism. And also looking at women and gender identity in South Korea as a soft power through this Gulf diplomacy, which we just heard from Julie. So first, I just want to say that I'm quite intrigued by Jiun's presentation. Just applying this idea of nationalism as a commodity, as economics, business. Who is profiting, who is not profiting from this type of thinking, and how it's produced and reproduced for consumption by citizens. And I think we could apply this idea, not only thinking about territorial disputes between South Korea and Japan, but also maybe somehow apply to our other presenters' topics. Just sort of looking at the changing characteristics of consumers, the citizens of South Korea, and the idea of this ethnic nationalism being continually repackaged. And also even nationalism being culturally exported in the form of sport diplomacy and being a tool to use in other countries. So there are a couple questions I want to ask the entire panel. Hopefully this makes sense. So one thing I want to start is just looking at inside South Korea. And I want to ask you, in terms of this commodified nationalism, and how is this passed down to the younger generations? So I know that right now we have this focus of how strong and strengthened nationalism is in terms of perhaps profit, and looking at sort of actual like consumer goods or experiences, and also looking at sort of Stephen's surveys on the different generations and how they associate themselves with that identity, and also in terms of looking at women and girls and in terms of promoting sort of this identity and nationalism and exporting that in the profit or the good of South Korea. So I'd like to start with Jiun, and we'll work our way to the right, if that's fine with you.
Great, thank you. So the question is, how is commodification of nationalism passed down to the younger generation? And that's a very, very interesting point, because I'm trying to think about or coin these sort of terms of, so there's, on the one hand, you have what I'm calling retail nationalism. But you need infrastructure, you need overhead. So something like Tokdo Ramen, when I was talking to the CEO of Tokdo Ramen, which by the way was very tasty, he was telling me how he was losing profit because it takes so much money to make the product. And so he really at this point is doing it for his own enjoyment and benefit. And so on the one hand, you have something like retail nationalism, which requires a lot of investment and money. And I think if you're someone who's young and don't necessarily have the money, then maybe that isn't as accessible. But on the other hand, you have something that I'm tentatively calling artisanal nationalism. And that's more micro level. There's a great website that sells comfort women related products, but nothing is very gaudy about them. They are very well made. They are actually very aesthetically appealing. And I think that's what makes it more artisanal. And that they just need a website, and they do very micro level processing and manufacturing. And so if you're someone who's younger and you have that sort of technological platform, then artisanal nationalism could very well be a channel for you to get your ideas out there and use the marketplace for political activity. And I think that's sort of how I see the connection to the younger generation in commodification of nationalism, at least in my case.
Just to confirm, I'm answering the same question, Eileen,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Okay. Jiyun's work is really interesting, and I want to sort of continue along the same thread of commodification, and then I'll make a comment that's perhaps more related to my own work. How is a particular identity passed from one generation to the next? I think it's a quite common phenomenon, and I think we are always in danger of, or actually just doing this, assuming that because we have a new generation, 25 years have passed, or conditions have changed, however you want to define a generation, that people who constitute that generation will think differently. They'll have a different identity. And I think we understate the power that parents have and the ease with which certain ideas are reproduced. In South Korea, for instance, one element that is, I would say, integral to the contemporary national identity is a certain anti-Japanese sentiment. It was founded in the colonial period. Many of you know the story. This is continually reproduced, and it's commodified, and the commodification itself reproduces it. If you look at the way in which An Jung-gun, who is the fellow in 1909 who shot and eventually killed Ito Hirobumi at a Harbin train station, he is a martyr. He is a national hero. And he is reproduced regularly in textbooks and schools and in plays, commodification. And that reproduces a certain national identity that may not necessarily change with this new age, with this era of ease of travel and internationalism and all these great isms and ideas about who we are as a young generation. I think it's remarkable how similar we are to our parents. And I don't think we should overlook that, because it's vitally important. Further to that, so that's my comment sort of connecting it to Jiyun's work, which is very interesting. I also think identity is, in addition to the reproduction of certain identities and the passing of ideas from parents to children, I think my work is suggesting that we should not overstate the influence of age and sort of natural life processes. I didn't go into my questions. I didn't go into my work thinking that that was what I was going to find. I was using age as the explanatory variable because that's what a lot of people are using, and it's a really interesting variable to see how things change as you get older. That's kind of what we're talking about today, isn't it? And you see that as you get older, you become more conservative. Why? Well, you get married, you get a job, you settle down. And when you do things like this, certain things tend to happen. And in the literature I talked about in political science, sociology, and elsewhere. Common sense. You become more conservative. And I think there's a relationship between that and what people think makes you whatever national identity. And I want to emphasize, I don't think it's just South Korea. I think it's here in the US and Canada. And the data kind of suggests it too, if you look at it. As one gets older, as you look across age, what it means, like ethnicity, which is a question that I asked my respondents, is a question that's been reproduced in other surveys. I just took from an existing survey that's been asked cross-nationally for about a decade and a half, and you see similar trends. I think that should make us a little uncomfortable, but we can't deny it, can we? Because life goes on, and certain processes take place.
I guess I'll start by defining nationalism in terms of sports. I see nationalism as being a sense that your country is superior, right? Is the best, and often the reason why the Olympics is such a popular worldwide event with viewership extremely high is because I think that it fuels that sense of nationalism, and there's so much pride behind an investment behind the gold medals because it shows undisputably that country is the best, right? Is superior in that specific sport, and I see that the players in the LPGA and other professional golf leagues is that they're playing not just for themselves, but they're playing on behalf of the country. And so when you see a leaderboard that ranks all the countries for each tournament, it's not just their name; they have their country's flag right next to it. And I think that many of the athletes also go in thinking that they're playing on behalf of their country, that they are sort of a national champion, and as a result, are national icons once they return home. I mean, there's ceremonies at the airport and flowers and fans and press whenever these athletes return home to their country after a win. And so fueling that sense of nationalism and providing that national pride through golf and through sports, I think has been fascinating for me. And the conference is called Young and Brave, but I would say that many of the young athletes that are playing professional golf right now are really the young and brave champions, because the average age is like 18 or 20, in the very early 20s, and they're going into different countries and playing on behalf of their country and themselves. And so I think seeing that unfold is a very interesting new form of nationalism.
Great, thank you. Just leading off from that, I kind of want to shift the panel discussion to the exporting of nationalism. So we've been looking within the views of South Korea and looking at national identity viewed by Koreans. And I'm curious about how this commodity of nationalism is exported to, say, the US. For instance, in my own experience in regards to seeing like Korean American groups in LA or in DC, New York, you do sometimes see the Tokdo label on newsletters for grocery stores, or you see a sticker maybe just posted onto the walls, like sort of graffiti art. So I'm kind of curious about what is, Jian, your take on this exporting nationalism as a commodity to the US or to other countries, and mostly it's advocated by the groups here. So I wanted to start with you first on that.
Great. So the question of exporting the commodity of nationalism. So in LA, it's quite frequent that you see something like Tokdo Moving Company driving around the city. And I believe there's Tokdo Wine in California. And I've been wanting to meet with the CEO to see his take on how he got it started. But to me, so my own work here that I explained was mainly on domestic consumption. And that's why it's different from something like militarization, which is more action-reaction across borders. Because I'm looking at how nationalism as an identity is consumed within borders, domestically, but with impacts across borders. And so when I think about something like exports, I'm hesitant to think that it is an export, because you rarely see, for one, non-Koreans in the business. It's mainly of Korean ethnicity that are getting into this sort of commodification. And so I'm not sure, it's a different space, but it's the same people doing the work. And so for me, I'm very hesitant to say that this export then has any different effect as it does domestically within South Korea. But I don't think, it's a very interesting question. I'm still on the fence about how I feel about the impact of exports. But to me, I don't think it really is an export because the effects are still the same and the same people do the commodification.
Great, thank you. I have one follow-up question for Stephen. You mentioned in the beginning of your PowerPoint, you opened up sort of dramatically in regards to the changing ethnic nationalism in Korea. And you also mentioned not just North Korean resettled groups, but also maybe migrant workers from other countries, or maybe there's also like Chinese Koreans or others who are a diversification of this ethnic Korean identity. And I was curious whether you ever thought of, from your long-term project, whether or not using that framework, this also applies to this group of ethnic Koreans, in this minority, and just your views on that. And also, I'm curious about, with time, let's say, hopefully you could continue your research for decades or for many years from now. And I'm just curious if you can still hold fact to that as you age, you tend to be more ethnically nationalist.
Thank you. So 2 questions I took from that. What do I think, or what is the potential for understanding the phenomenon that I'm interested in with other groups who have resettled in South Korea, such as Chinese Koreans, migrant laborers, and so on? And the second is about reproduction of the surveys and of findings. So the first question, I'm glad you brought it up. So I want to tell you, I attempted you start very ambitiously in the dissertation project, and you sort of narrow it down as time goes on because you're confronted with financial, emotional, and psychological limitations. I wanted to include, as a second group, Chinese Koreans, either those who were born and raised in Yanbian, the autonomous prefecture in Jilin province, or Chinese Koreans in South Korea, of which there are hundreds of thousands. I still might include, maybe not for the dissertation, but at some point, the Chinese Korean group. And it would indeed be interesting to survey them using the same questions. Because it matters that in my study, I was looking at North Koreans, because it's taking advantage of what some might call a natural experiment. You have a divided peninsula, a divided people, who then grow up and come of age under fundamentally different structural conditions, political, social, and otherwise. And how does this affect a number of things? Well, I'm looking at identity. So the fact that they moved themselves from North Korea to South Korea and resettled has opened up a really interesting avenue of inquiry that's been reproduced elsewhere in Germany and has been done in a similar fashion in North America, looking at people in Saskatchewan and North Dakota who are otherwise similar but are in Canada and the United States, which are different places. So maybe I'll be writing something about the Chinese Koreans who have settled. The other groups, I don't know what to do. So if we're looking at migrant laborers, who are from, Bangladesh, what do we ask them? What do we want to know about them? How apart do they feel of South Korean society? I can tell you it's not very. They don't feel very integrated. But what about the children of international marriages? Data shows that South Koreans see them as basically Korean. They see them as more part of South Korean society than they see Chinese Koreans, for instance. So exploring those interesting outcomes is something I want to do. The second part, just doing research going forward, I think that, especially in the social sciences and science perhaps in general, there is a tendency to have a finding, to make a splash, and then go do something else. But reproduction is sort of the essence of the scientific inquiry, isn't it? To see whether or not what you're finding is actually true. You need it, like 2, 3, 4 times before it can be considered an actual finding. So if you're from a funding agency out there and you find my work interesting, talk to me on the side afterwards, because I am very interested in continuing to do it. Really, I am. With my collaborators, we are most interested in continuing this project after we're all doing our PhDs, but after we do them, we want to continue doing it. To see whether what we're finding is as an actual finding or is like an aberration or is due to some other effect. So yeah, I'm very open to doing that. I want to.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen. I think I abused my power as a moderator because I only left you 10 minutes to ask some questions to... Okay, 15 minutes. Great, thank you. So we're going to have a mic go around, and I will select you, and I ask that you please identify yourself. So, sir in the front.
Hi, Chris McRae, World Class Brands. I'd like to sort of congratulate everyone in terms of putting a focus both on sports and national identities. Actually, 25 years ago, I've been researching fast-moving consumer goods brands all through the 80s, and we found there was a problem that the classical model was one product, one brand, one country. Basically, there were no platforms for going global. So basically, sports and national identities have been borrowed by brands over the last 25 years. So my question is, how do you use the sort of risks and opportunities of that to actually be brave for young people under 35's goals like sustainability or whatever your goals are, given that in a way, what you're looking at is sort of at the nexus between how these things have been manipulated the last 25 years by big concerns, but where you maybe want to go as a generation which is either borderless or has, you know, issues which are unique to your times.
That was great. Thank you for that really insightful question. I think you're right. A lot of corporations now, you know, traditional marketing for the younger generation has been shifting more towards sponsoring sporting events or trying to move towards sort of the online and what the younger generation is consuming, and that's often not so much products, but it is sporting events and other activities and experiences. So absolutely. And your second part of the question, I'm sorry.
I was particularly interested in your organization because okay, many of the big sports organizations actually own their superstars to a large degree, and you appear to be saying, in a way, that your young stars had more freedom to choose what they stood for. Is that what you did say, or, and if so, how could you use the advantage of ladies' professional golf in that direction?
Sure. I think so many of the players have issues that they are personally passionate about, whether that's breast cancer awareness, heart health, and often some of the tournaments are also do charity programs and associate themselves with a charity that often if the players do like a hole-in-one or a birdie, then a certain amount will go to charities identified before the game. But I think that, you know, you see the younger generation and some of the athletes perhaps using their platform to promote issues that are concern to them. From the LPGA perspective, it's often women empowerment, right? How do you provide women with a career track? And I think what Sari Park had showed Korea in the 1998 was that professional golf can be a viable career track that provides a global recognition for women to succeed. And I think that's what's really fascinating in Korea right now is that, you know, what's a category where you see Korean women really being at the forefront globally? And I would have to say from my point of view right now, it's currently only golf, where you see a very global recognition that they're sort of developing their own career, and that I think is something that might speak to your question.
Okay, thank you. I want to take a couple questions to Darcy in the back, and let her answer that first. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Darcy Drought. I'm with Johns Hopkins University. I have As a student of citizenship, this is particularly interesting to me as you kind of parse the different contours of Korean ethnic or other aspects of Korean identity. So I have two related questions to Stephen and to Julie. The first is to Stephen, looking at your data driven from North Korean migrants living in South Korea, I wonder if you could kind of discuss the contours of how you distinguish North Korean national identity, ethnic identity, and nationalism, because it seems that there's a couple steps that need to be made in order to make some claims about ethnic nationalism, especially if you're looking at a population that necessarily has a different relationship to the South Korean state than South Korean, ethnic Korean South Koreans. If I'm clear. And then, that's probably a lot of jargon. And then to Julie, you mentioned how in the case of the migration of a lot of these athletes, they take on different citizenships. So, for example, Lydia Ko now has New Zealand citizenship, but she was born in South Korea, and still, a lot of Koreans identify her as part of the diaspora. So I wonder if you could kind of just explain a little bit about how these migrated athletes, how different populations receive these different these athletes. How does New Zealand receive Lydia Ko, and how does South Korea see Lydia Ko, for example? Thanks.
Great. I would like to take another question to this gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is Phil Wilcox. I'm a former graduate student at USC and former classmate of Dr. Jun Bang. And this is a question for, first of all, I want to say it's a very interesting seminar, and it's very thought-provoking as well. Questions for you, Dr. Jun Bang, but other people can contribute as well. I'm a student for Chinese nationalism, but it translates to South Korea as well. For example, in Chinese nationalism, especially after Tiananmen, there was the patriotic education campaign, which focused a lot on anti-Japanese sentiment to teaching for children. But the Chinese government found that it's very difficult to control these nationalist sentiments, to find it as a negative. And also, recently, in a recent panel at Brookings, said because of a lot of tourism, which is something you mentioned, June, of China to Japan, and the relatively positive feedback from the tourists returning back to China, that especially the young generation, that tendency is sort of diminished. Like the people aren't as upset about Japan as they might have been before. But you focus more about tourism to those contested territories, which is different in a sense, which doesn't really happen as much for the Diaoyutai or Senkaku Islands. People don't usually go to those islands as tourist events. So I was wondering, maybe there's any experience of South Koreans traveling to Japan, if that might, especially younger generation, if that might reduce the impact of like nationalism amongst those younger generation people, or if it's just different, just go to the islands themselves. So it's a pretty different aspect of going to those specific countries rather than going to those contested territories. So thank you very much.
So how about we work from to my right, and also take the opportunity if you want to add any closing remarks to your presentation, or just sort of wrap it up for your own points. Thank you.
Thanks, Darcy, for that question. I think, as I said earlier, really defining the definition of identity has changed, I think, over increasingly as we see in sports. What does an identity mean? Even outside of sports, Dr. Moon was earlier mentioning how many of us have lived in different countries for extensive periods of time and speak different languages. Do we, even outside of sports, have a very singular identity? And I think that's a question that our generation has to really consider deeply. In terms of sports, I think that you see after a tournament, an athlete will win, and they'll often drape their country flag over them when they receive the trophy. And that symbol in and of itself is often a self-identification. So recently in the Evian Championship, Eun-ji-chun won, and she's from Korea, and so they draped her in a Korean flag. And Lydia Ko would drape herself in a New Zealand flag, which she did at the Olympics as well. And I think that, really self-selecting in a way what country you choose to identify with, which flag you choose to wave when you're playing on an international stage has become a way to define one's identity. But it's really something I think that might need further academic studying, and is how identity is different in sports versus in other categories.
Thanks again to Darcy for the good questions. Darcy, stop me if I don't get it quite right, like if I did not quite understand your question. But you're saying that what we have here are two different groups of people who I'm asking the same question about a national identity of one of the countries to which one of the groups exclusively belongs to. I'm making an assumption that both groups self-identify as ethnic Koreans. And I could, in theory, include, given my interest in my design, any ethnic Koreans anywhere. Because in part, what I'm looking at here is whether or not being elsewhere has any effect on your answer. Because these people move. The group the North Korean migrants in this case move. So I can, in theory, measure the impact that being in different locations has on their responses. And I think it's worth pointing out, too, that I'm reproducing questions, the exact same questions that were asked to South Koreans for the resettled North Korean migrants. So I'm asking them, what does it mean to be truly, sometimes they translate it as Korean, which can be a bit misleading, because it's Hangukin, which means South Korean, probably. So what does it mean to be truly South Korean? And then you have there's seven different endings to the beginning of that question, and I was focusing on 3 of them. So what I ended up looking at here was whether growing up in North Korea, being in China, and then being in South Korea has any effect on how they perceived the important qualities of South Korean national identity. And the answer is that it doesn't. Did that answer the question, Darcy? I feel like it didn't. Well, we should talk about it with everyone. But I mean, yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
So Phil, thank you for being a great colleague and putting me on the spot. I think twofold. So the first question about you bringing up China, I think it gets to this term that social scientists are in love with, which is generalizability. How generalizable is my theory? And I can assure you, I did look at China and its dispute with Diaoyutai Senkaku with Japan. And it's fascinating because, in a way, it tracks really well with what Brookings said and Dr. Moon said about money talking in China. Money really talks because it's not very capitalist in that way, where you see a lot of commodification of nationalism surrounding Diaoyutai Senkaku. And I briefly looked at the number of trademarks under Diaoyutai in China, and there's a lot of registered trademarks. And this gets to the second point about state power and how you mentioned the idea of state being able to or not being able to control this sense of nationalism and the activity surrounding nationalism. And it's a great question because I think the state itself is trying to negotiate its power, and especially when nationalism becomes embedded in this marketplace. And in a way, I think there is a very important role for the state, though, still, regardless of gatekeeping nationalism. And if I can, I just wanted to bring up one slide. If AV, oh, okay. So I myself was interested in how the state was negotiating its power with all this commercial activity, right? And so I decided to look at, I'm hoping it will magically appear. So I looked at how the patent office actually gatekeeps which trademarks it decides to accept and which it decides to reject. And because it's a very interesting case, because if you look at South Korea, there's an accumulative total of 129 applications that have been accepted between 98 to 2014, you have 129 applications, but then you actually have 230 rejections. So in a way, you have more rejections than applications. And so the patent office itself is also very conscious about its role of gatekeeping, what gets filtered and what doesn't. And so in this way, you also see the state negotiating its power that way and controlling. And so my final remark just goes back to Eileen's great comment about thinking about who is profiting and who is not. Something I wanted to share, which is interesting. So under the Dokdo Sustainable Use Project, DSUP, you see that the number of ministries that got money to get involved in Dokdo increased from 2 to 12, and the budget increased from 5 million to 650 million by 2013. And there's a great chart that I wanted to show that shows who is actually getting the bulk of that money, which is not the foreign ministry, which we love to talk about in terms of this territorial dispute. It is, drum roll, it's actually Ministry of Fisheries. And it's because building things cost a lot of money. And so they saw a budget increase of over 15,000% from 2004 to 2013. And 62% of that money goes to facilities construction and management. And that was an increase of 23,000% over the same period. And so thinking about who is profiting and who is not, I think is a very great question.
So that brings us to the close of our panel. I would like to thank our panelists here to share their expertise with us today. I do not want to keep us any longer from lunch, so we will break until 12:30 for our next panel. And let's go ahead and congratulate our excellent panelists today.